It was certainly a pretty complicated introduction. It's a pleasure being here, although I'm kind of off the hook teaching my intro to ecology in an amphitheater that looks just like this. Not so new, but as big. So I hope you're going to be more interested than actually my students that tend to be very attracted to their screen, chatting or something. So it's a real pleasure being here. It's the first time actually I come to UBC as a professor. I had only come here as a tourist many years ago, and I've been agonizing over this talk, changing it. It says version 4, but it's probably version 25. Because since I've arrived, I've been thinking, oh, but they're all scientists, and I'm talking more about policy and back and forth. But yesterday, discussing with Sally, I went back to a more policy kind of talk, in line very much with my title. And the rationale for my choice is the fact that this price that paid my trip all the way from Montreal to Vancouver, I really had it, I think, because of my impact on environmental policy, and in the discussions I've had with many faculties and students, that seemed to be something of interest. So I'm going to, I guess, bring you in my world, and it's going to be the typical talk of a professor, so I'm going to largely present work done by my graduate students. The context of at least the policy-oriented part of my work is really one of the changing climate. And my increased concern for that's motivated some of my work. So for those of you who are less familiar, what I find a preoccupation is the lack of ambition of generally our governments throughout the planet. And one undergrad in my lab, he actually predicted if we take the current global agreement for reducing emissions, what impact should it have on climate? And the prediction is an increase in temperature by about 3 degrees Celsius. And there's been people that have published similar numbers. Yet scientists are warning against a warming up of more than 2 degrees. So we're very much at the edge, according to the science we have, of the sustainability of ecosystem under the current mitigation policy globally. So I've been very engaged in the policy of climate change under a mechanism that's called RED, for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. I kind of fell in that a little bit by coincidence. I was working in Panama. I was working on estimating forest carbon stocks. The Panamanian government knew I was doing that. And the climate change negotiation that started to discuss this issue was held in Montreal in 2005. So I actually was invited by the government of Panama to become their negotiator, largely, I believe, on the ground that I was free. I was in Montreal. They didn't have to pay a plane ticket. They did not have to pay my salary, nor my hotel. So it started a long-term interaction between me and the Panamanian government that formalized itself. And I actually was the head negotiator for RED between 2005 and 2009. This picture is taken in Copenhagen. For those of you who followed the climate change policy, you know this was a very traumatic negotiation that failed. And that picture is taken the last night where everything failed. And I kept negotiating thereafter for 2 more years another agenda, which is the nationally appropriate mitigation action from developing countries. So I'm really a biologist, but I've learned policy, I guess, by doing, with good and bad. So RED has become an incredibly popular venture internationally. And the finance that are on the table, according to donor, is close to $4 billion. So this is a completely unprecedented amount of finance directed to the forest of the tropical world, of the developing world. It's a mind-boggling increase. And you want to ask yourself, why is that so important? Well, emissions from deforestation in the tropics, they probably by now represent about 12% of emission worldwide. When the negotiation of REDD started, people believe it was more like 20-25. But there was a very influential report by Sir Nicholas Stern that was asked for by the Queen of England. And Sir Nicholas Stern, in his report on the economy of climate change, said that avoiding deforestation in the tropics would be the single cheapest and easiest way to reduce emission and get the climate under control. So, of course, that fueled a lot of attention by countries, and I'm cynically saying especially because it was from Britain and they really don't have much tropical forest. So the efforts to stop that deforestation, they didn't really have to do it. But you would wonder then, why did the developing world become so receptive to that? Because currently we have 42 developing countries trying to actively fight deforestation. Well, because those 42 developing countries saw the potential for a new income stream that would allow them to actually get to grips with their land use problem. So REDD is still is going on, and it's a pretty popular activity. So I'm going to really bring you to Panama. Some people in the room have been in Panama, so that's where I spend about half of my year. It's a small tropical country that is bridging the Americas, so we're neighboring to Colombia and to Costa Rica. The first part of the talk, I will sort of introduce you to the efforts of my lab in trying to estimate emissions from deforestation. All of this international attention and all of this money is geared to the fact that we need to actually stop deforestation, but then account for how much emissions have we really been able to reduce. And that's estimating and reducing uncertainty around this emission is very, very important, because there's going to be an offset mechanism. That is, developed countries will put on the table, or are putting on the table, money to offset the emissions. So basically, if Canada wants to use REDD as a mechanism to improve the emissions of Canada, we want to know really from deforestation how much carbon have we avoided and how much carbon then are we emitting in Canada, so these two can sum to zero. So the IPCC guidelines suggest that to measure the emissions reduction, we need two kinds of data, and that's the jargon used by IPCC. Activity data basically are maps, okay, so land cover changes, and emission factors are the density of carbon in a 1 hectare basis of forest. So these are the two sort of information that we need to calculate emissions. And throughout the talk, just for you, so that I don't have to repeat, you will see little pictures changing, and she's the PhD student that was doing this research. She's now a postdoc at the Woods Hole Center. So to kind of give them credit, they will appear as I go through the slides. So we've been taking the real data of Panama. So the data that the government had in their hand at the time, that they shared with us, to actually look at the quality of the information that is available to do a sort of an error calculation around their emissions. Again, in the context of a carbon market where emissions reduced in Panama offset emissions from the developed world, we really want to know what's the error around those emissions. So one of the first findings that Joanne did, which is not a surprise, I guess, for most of you that are doing remote sensing, is that any map, so in this example, the map of forest cover for Panama in 1992, was in fact produced by a collage of different satellite images that were obtained at different times. Okay? That's because Panama, like many tropical countries, is a high cloud country. So if you looked at a given year, you might not see anything because the cloud cover was too much. So the government of Panama, and that's a very standard practice, they optimized the images they can take by making this collage of different images. Then deforestation is estimated by comparing two images. So you can imagine in Panama, they compared the image for 1992 with the image of 2000 to get their baseline, okay, baseline deforestation. In 2000, likewise, the collage is made with images coming from different years. So at any given point in the country, you have different time interval between the images that you're taking. And yet the government has been using this as 1992 and comparing that with an image called 2000 that also had a 4 or 5 years range between the two images. So a very important source of uncertainty, I think relatively easy to deal with. Another sort of error that we've been finding is the error on what we call this emission factor, or the carbon concentration on a per unit of landscape. And I think it's particularly obvious if you compare those two lines here. The blue line and the green line, actually Kate Kirby, I don't know where she did her PhD with whom, but she did her PhD here at UBC after doing her master in my lab. What Kate did is she took data in the field, plot level data, estimating carbon, and then analyzed their carbon data with two different equations. And you can see the impact that this has on the estimate of carbon stock, huge. Basically, if I'm looking at this graph and I'm taking the default value given by IPCC for the type of forest in which we work, and this equation produced by Brown that people find a very solid equation, we have more than 100% change in the carbon stock that we emit on the same forest unit. So we summed all of these errors in an error analysis, trying to pinpoint at where is the bulk of the uncertainty when we measure carbon emissions. We had, besides the two that I illustrated, we looked at the forest follow carbon density, so as forests regrow, how much carbon are in their forest. In fact, for Panama, there's only 2 studies that have been done looking at that, so very, very scant. The snapshot effect looked at, in a timeline, if you're looking at forest cover change over, say, 10 years, and you find a forest that is regrowing in both, you actually don't know what happened during that time interval. It's possible that a forest grew, was cut, and grew again, but that's completely, it's completely hidden by the data. And also, we noticed there was very significant difference in classification, especially of regrowing forests. Whether you classify, a regrowing forest as a forest or a secondary forest or intervened forest, you have enormous impact on your emissions estimate. But the bottom line was that the single worst problem we have is we really don't know how much carbon is there per unit surface in a forest. And that's accounting only for the above-ground carbon biomass. So the error associated with that single term is more than 50%. Why does that matter? This is a scenario representing emissions through time, okay? Different scenario of land use for Panama. These different lines are scenarios that the government of Panama suggested would be realistic policy to implement on the landscape level. So in red, you have the kind of baseline, what would happen. And if I'm looking, for example, at this one, it is a scenario where 50% of the deforestation in Panama would be successfully implemented. Okay? That was the recommendation of the Stern report. But look at these blue lines. These are the confidence interval that come from our model for uncertainty. It means that even if Panama was actively successful at stopping deforestation by half, reducing deforestation by half, there would be no way statistically to show that this has happened because of the magnitude of errors around the estimates. So think back of the fact that REDD is supposed to be an offset mechanism whereby developed country will be buying carbon reduction to developing nation. In that context, it's very hard to justify. It opens the door to activities that in fact will be creating hot air, that is actions that will not lead to any reduction, real emissions reduction, or developed country won't pay for that because they will say, well, you say you've reduced emissions by 50%, but we cannot see this signal. So this has been a major, or this is still a major research question in my lab. And one of the initiatives in which we're collaborating is actually teaming up with the group based in Stanford University of Dr. Greg Asner, who has been developing LiDAR with airborne LiDAR to fly over the territory. And he's actually claiming that using LiDAR mapping, you can increase enormously the precision of carbon estimates. The reason why Dr. Asner is saying that is LiDAR really works a little bit like the laser. I often use this analogy of driving too fast, right? If you're driving too fast, this laser that the police is using is sending a beam and coming back to the receptor. It's measuring the speed of return. So the LiDAR plane works in the same way. It is sending some beam downward. It's sending beam downward, and if the beam hits the ground, it's going to have a longer return time than if the beam hits the top of the vegetation. So it is believed that if you fly with LiDAR, you can reconstruct the tridimensional structure of a forest, so have a good measure of its height, and that it's the height of a forest then is a pretty good measure of carbon. So Dr. Asner came to Panama 2 years ago, and he flew a transect all around the country to actually measure carbon under this transect, and then using some algorithm filling in the rest of the country. So this is the map of carbon that is lab produced. And when you have very dark red, these are zones of high carbon stock. Okay, I don't think I have no more battery, but it's okay. My interest and my role in that, here looking at this other map in colors, you have indigenous territories. And that's how I got involved in this work with Dr. Asner. So he basically has a plane. That plane flies over, supposedly takes the best technology to create this excellent carbon map. But that leaves the people that lives on this territory completely unengaged of the effort of measuring carbon. Then this map is given to them, and from that map, the government or they themselves could extract the carbon, their assets. I'm really more interested in engaging with people. So my role in that has been to actually go in the field with people and verifying this technology to see if the results from what people see in the ground is actually meeting or is the same as what the airplane is saying. So this part of Panama is called Darien. This is the easternmost part of Panama. And for those of you who know a little bit the tropical forest, the forest of Darien has been classified as one of the 10th most endangered forest frontier of the world. The Pan American Highway stops here, okay, and it starts in Colombia. So all of this part is really remote access jungles where the people that live there are indigenous people. My interest to work in Panama with indigenous people really comes from the fact that they are, or they've been said to be the first custodian of this forest. So this is work from one of my PhD students. What he did is he actually used Panama's official forest cover map. So in green here you see the forest of Panama that was the map of 1992, and Gerardo mapped the indigenous territories. So all of these blue lines here delineate indigenous territories in Panama. So our playground, we're working in this region in particular. So I'm going to show you a short animation to see how forest has been receding in the country. And I suggest that you sort of concentrate looking in this part of the country. Okay, so this was the forest cover in 1992, and you can see again indigenous territories in blue. So 2000 and 2008. So he actually used those maps to quantify forest loss inside and outside indigenous territories. And it goes without saying that in Panama, the main actor for forest conservation are indigenous people. In fact, nowadays, 60% of Panama's primary forests are in indigenous lands. So as we were engaging with our indigenous partner to say, let's go under this LiDAR and let's see if that plane that flew over your territory developed a real picture of your land, I decided to try and develop try a new method for working on carbon. And that stems a lot from some of the more scientific work that we've been doing. This is a map of a very famous forest plot. It's a forest plot in the island of Barro, Colorado. It has 50 hectares. And this plot has been monitored since 1885. Every 5 years, every single stem is measured for growth. So it is the longest lasting record of the growth of tropical forest that exists in the tropics. But if you look at this, what I want to point out is that the dispersion of carbon on this plot is not equal. Each of these little squares is 1 hectare, and the different colors represent different carbon concentration. So most of the study we do on the ground in the tropical forest, because we're limited by funds, we are actually measuring relatively small plots. In my lab, we used to measure plots at about a radius of 30 meters. So we're completely unable to capture this variability of carbon at the landscape level. In Barro, Colorado, the students who worked with this plot, Marie-Carmen Ruiz, she actually showed that the carbon, and it's really not surprising, the bulk of the carbon is only contained in the big trees. And that's something that we've seen repeatedly, whether we looked at pristine forest or forest in human landscape. There tends to be a few species that become very big trees, and these big trees then in turn are the ones that hold the bulk of the biomass. So to do the work in indigenous territory under this LiDAR SWAT, we decided to adopt a sort of a trade-off and spend time to do a lot more surface. So we've actually tried to maximize the number of hectares that we visited and decrease, the trade-off was decrease the precision of what we were measuring. So normally we would go in the forest and measure every trees, the small trees, the big trees, the shrubs, the litter, and everything. And we decided instead to work on plots that were 1 hectare and only measure the big tree. And this was I was really inspired by the rapid biodiversity assessment. People in conservation biology for a long time, they figured out that if they're going to go and count all the insects and all the birds and all the animals and all the plants, they'll never be able to do anything. So they found some quick way or indicator to try and measure biodiversity. So this is our attempt to develop a rapid carbon assessment to be able to point out to where are the carbon stored at the landscape level. But again, the most important aspect of that, I think the novelty, is trying to bring together the LiDAR flight. So here is a map obtained from LiDAR-derived data in an indigenous land with having indigenous people actually making the measurements. So if technology will allow, I will ask you to actually look at the other screen and I'll stop talking. And the context of climate change, there is this huge interest to stop deforestation. And again, if indigenous people in Panama, they control 60% of primary forests, they will be key actors for this, agenda of conserving the forest. So about 3 years ago, we started a large program of training of technicians, indigenous chiefs and technicians on this proposal. It's a big territory, 200,000 hectares. Last year, a scientist from California, Dr. Greg Asner, he flew over this landscape with a plane, and he measured carbon with what we scientists consider probably one of the most advanced technology.
Cada equipo tiene flag intake, cada equipo tiene la cinta diamétrica y una wincha. Entonces, jefe de equipo, tú agregas tu cosa y tú lo distribuyes a tu gente.
So we're currently establishing the line along a plot of 1 hectare that corresponds exactly to 1 hectare that has been measured by the LiDAR plane, because we want to validate the data of the LiDAR with the people from the community, because for them, in order to actually believe that this plane that takes data from the sky is taking data that are meaningful, they really need to see a part of that for themselves. And then within that forest, measure the height of trees and their diameter, as well as the species identification. These are the 3 elements that we actually need to estimate the carbon, the above ground carbon stock, as we say it.
74.1 altura.
We're sort of a bridge, acting as a bridge between this really high-tech technology and their belief system and their understanding of their own, forested landscape. Maybe you recognize a graduate from UBC there? You did not? Did you, Sally? Yeah. Okay. So I had one of the person on that team actually was somebody who finished his bachelor degree in forestry and biked to Panama and drop on to our team. So some of the results we got from that were quite unexpected, and I'm not going to make comment really on whether this airplane was lying or not. That's how people said that. When people were explaining what they were doing in the field, they were saying, we're going to verify if that airplane is lying. And it was very interesting to me because I took part in a lot of meetings with the chiefs, and the chiefs were saying, this airplane cannot be right because it doesn't talk to us, it doesn't see us, it doesn't understand how we use the forest. So I'm not going to talk about that because I don't feel confident to make any statement. We're just going through the data. But something that we found, and just have a look at this, in yellow here, this is the average carbon stock that we find in the forest of Barro Colorado Island, in the part of this plot that we considered as pristine forest. So what we found in this actually in this territory is carbon stocks that are way higher than what we considered as the standard staple, comparison for forest. In yellow, these are forests that were previously logged, so that's why the carbon is less. But we seem to be finding forests with an exceptionally high carbon content on this indigenous landscape, which of course the chiefs were very happy to see. And to put this in perspective, from this very, very preliminary work, our average carbon stock over the landscape was 175, whereas in Barro Colorado it's 150. These in red are all of the carbon density for the different plots that are managed by Smithsonian throughout the tropics. So it seems like we've been hitting on a very exceptional forest with very, very high carbon stock, something we're not used to find in Panama. I asked Dr. Asner if I could use those photographs. They are actually real photographs of LiDAR from the territory where we went. And in red, these are tree crowns for trees taller than 50 meters. And in those plots that the people flagged for us in the indigenous territory, they found more than 50 trees in 20 hectares that were taller than 50 meters. And in comparison, in Barro, Colorado, there's a single one. So again, that seems to suggest that we've been we've been finding a very exceptional forest by going really far like this inside indigenous territory. And of course, I'm hoping that future research will allow us to look at how, these forest carbon, is that true? Are there more of them? And are these very high carbon landscape associated with very high biodiversity? And I'm certainly hoping I'm going to be able to bridge that to mammal species, maybe, and birds also. One reason for being interested in that is that it doesn't seem in any capacity that forest carbon alone can generate any income to sustain the conservation of these forests. And I'm interested in seeing if we can bundle together different ecosystem service. I'm going to now change and after I think hopefully showing you that I'm still able to do some biology, move more in the realm of people and policy and climate change. Because my real interest in developing this RED agenda, well, there was, of course, the pleasure of going in the forest and measuring and working with uncertainties. But I'm really wondering if RED can become an alternative, can improve the livelihoods of the people that live near the forest. So what we've been doing in my lab group is working using participatory methods such as participatory mapping and participatory assessment of future land use. We've been working in all of the different indigenous territories of eastern Panama, trying to reconstruct land use change through time, and then trying to have people to say, well, if nothing is done, if we leave you use the land the way you do, what will carbon stock become in the future? So in this particular slide, you see the result of such an analysis done with the community. In red, we have the forest. This is a community that was relocated after the construction of an hydroelectric dam. So when they arrived, it was pristine forest, and it's expected that this forest will then will be cut down as people try and make a livelihood. But what was interesting at the time of this study is that people said, well, if nothing is done, we will just cut the forest and cut the forest and cut the forest and cut the forest. And their own prediction was that in 20 years, they would remove about half of the existing forest carbon stock. And so that got them thinking, and that inspired them in seeking to enter a voluntary carbon market. And that really cliche picture here, where obviously my friend, Mr. Pacheco, normally doesn't dress like that. He actually did dress that for the picture. Is celebrating the moment where that community signed a contract with the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. The Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute is our partner in Panama, and they decided to go carbon neutral. So they did a sort of analysis in-house, and whatever emissions they could not reduce, they decided to offset them by buying carbon. And the total contract was for 3 years, and it contained a part of reforestation, so that's rebuilt carbon stock, and a part of avoiding deforestation. Okay, there was also a buffer zone. So for the people of that village, carbon became a real reality because there was about 20 different families that engaged into selling carbon as part of their new livelihood strategy. The part of avoiding deforestation was decided by the village. And the village had a very interesting sort of proposal. They said we should put signs. So this is an example of our sign. We're going to reforest a buffer zone in front of the part of the forest we want to protect from deforestation. And we're going to train local ranger. So we actually did put those signs, and you don't know this, but here on this sign, this is even the logo of the Ministry of Environment that sort of helps in this. But maybe you can see that behind the sign, you have a completely devastated forest. And this is not because we actually put the sign in the middle of a devastated forest. We actually put the sign in front of a very nice forest. And we came back 3 months later to find that despite the sign, despite the desire, despite the exchange of money, that forest was gone. And we actually measured that, and we had almost 40 hectares of forest cut down at the heap of time where Panamanians cut the forest, which is in the dry season. That's the time where the forest is cut and burned for cattle ranching. So we thought we were very clever. We had measured carbon stock. We had found a buyer. We had people that wanted to sell carbon. And this was a complete failure. Because what we had not understood is that pressure was not coming just from inside. When we started this project, we started to engage in the classic literature, finding sustainable livelihoods for people, giving them other means. But they were fine. They did not cut any of that forest. The people who cut the forest came from outside, because this landscape, this indigenous landscape, is obviously embedded in a matrix of land that is used mostly by colonist farmers. So while the whole literature and the whole interest of RED is trying to think, how will you sustain the people who want to protect or grow carbon, and how will you affect leakage, so displacement of activity, we found that in a country like Panama, where land title is not very stable, the big problem came from outside. And what is happening outside is a culture of migration, where we have people that come from Western Panama migrating actually to Eastern Panama in search for land and opportunities. So in red here, you see the pattern of deforestation between 1992 and 2000. Okay? And this migration is again largely due to these poor farmers. So we then started to look at how colonist farmers use the land, and I'm afraid that there's a sort of a leaky pipeline between McGill and UBC, and I'm afraid that UBC has the stronger part of that, because this is the second master's student of mine that went from McGill to UBC. So Guillaume, who's in the room, did this work. So for us, it was a completely different chain. It was a completely different human system to look at. Okay, we had never considered colonist farmer. I'd been working by that time for 15 years with indigenous people, sort of pretending they had no neighbors. And that was very interesting, because we started to think, well, not only do indigenous people have neighbors, but actually these neighbors need to be factored in any solution to the land that we have. And the main message, at least that I got from this study, was colonist farmers are not bad intentioned at all. Basically, they want to improve their living condition. They're very poor. They often live on very unstable economies, and they do what they know. And what they know is cut the forest, burn the forest, and put cows on it. Okay? So they are reproducing a sort of land use pattern that we consider unsustainable, because that's what they know. So there's a very clearly contrasting vision of the landscape. The lights are very strong in the front, so I'm sorry that maybe you don't see things so well. I should have done that earlier.
I'm sorry. Let's try that one.
Oh yeah, I should have done that for the little movie. But just look at this picture. We say that one picture is worth 1,000 words. So this is an indigenous land, and this is the colonist farmer landscape. Okay, same topography, bordering. So their vision and the desire is really very different if we take those two groups, social groups that take part in the same landscape. We actually quantified that throughout Panama. The legend is a bit cumbersome here. So you have the different color bars that showing you the forest cover depending on land tenure. In 1992, in black, the white 2008. So this is a time trend for different land use tenure, or for different land tenure. Comarca, these ones are indigenous territory that are fully legalized, where indigenous people fully control their land. This is the overlap between indigenous territory and protected area. These are indigenous land claims that overlap with protected area and private and public lands. Okay? So there's two things I want to point out. The region where I work is largely a region where the land claims have not been settled. So we are in this region. And we can see that in that region there was early on a very important decrease in forest cover, but this has stabilized. And that in public and private land, which in fact in Panama is now the single smallest portion of the landscape, it's quite impressive. Here we have a continued trend for deforestation. This graph also shows that protected area do a very good job at protecting the land. So the work that we're currently doing is work that is intercultural. So we've started to work now with the Colonist Farmers and with the two indigenous groups that live in the eastern Panama. And together they've agreed to sort of work on three different dimensions. One is improved agricultural production, not only, but including sustainable production, but also they're very interested in oil palm. So we're going to see in the next future whether it's possible to add oil palm to a system without having this system to tip in a place where we don't. People have decided to engage in conflict resolution since the main driver of land or forest degradation has been land invasion. So colonist farmer getting into indigenous land. And if you think about the previous graph, there is almost no free land in Panama anymore. So as there are more, landless farmers, they're going to turn around and they're going to go either invading indigenous land or invading national parks. So there needs to be some resolution, I think, to try to deal with that. And then we're also trying to create positive spaces for collaboration. And that's very much one of my beliefs now. I think that when something has failed for a long time, it's probably good to push the reset button and try to do things differently. So in the region where we're working, there's been land use conflict going on for almost 40 years and constant environmental degradation throughout this time period. So we've been discussing with people trying to see common interest and common concern. And the common concern that they've identified was a concern for their youth. Apparently, young people are not interested in agriculture, which might be good for the forest, actually. But there's a lot of things going through eastern Panama. It's an important road for drug dealing. So we've engaged in a collaboration with the Wapikoni Mobile. Maybe you've heard of them, maybe not, because it's far. It's in eastern Quebec. It's in eastern Canada. Wapikoni is a group of filmmakers that are specialized in training indigenous people, young indigenous people, in making film, as a way to reclaim identity and as a way to strengthen them. And in Quebec, it's really an anti-suicide adventure. And so they actually came to Panama, and we've engaged in sort of creating a school of making documentary and school of filmmaking associated with a festival of environmental documentary. And it's been very interesting because this completely crazy initiative is actually a common initiative of the three human groups we have on that landscape. And in 40 years, it's the first time they actually cooperate on something, and everybody finds that's cool. So we'll see where this kind of wave is bringing us. The conclusion of this is twofold for me. I started to work on forest for carbon, for climate change. And my conclusion is that the real resource that's at stake is not so much the forest, but it's the land. And we really have to think differently at forest conservation in the context of land scarcity. Okay? So that's what we have. We have a country where land is largely allocated, but that is leaving out several landless people. And that's not uncommon in Latin America. So we started using, alternative livelihood techniques within the community. Then we thought, we need to deal with conflicts with our invaders. And now we really feel that we need to work with all of these levels, but including the government. So that's why I put this picture of a chain under the comparison of this chain. If we want to actually stop deforestation, our action needs to tackle the policy at the governmental level, as well as, the traditional authority and the local people and their dwelling and their livelihood. So we cannot spare any of those levels. So we've created an intersectorial advisory board on forest. We've invited around this table people from the NGO sector. We have the police, we have government representatives, we have the church, we have traditional indigenous authorities, private landowner, we have the head of the Cattle Rancher Association. And all of these people are trying to resolve this problem for the greater country. So it's created a sort of a neutral space where we're saying, okay, if we want to protect these forests, but at the same time there's all these farmers that have no land, how should we do that? And I've been therefore very much feeding the Panamanian government with policy suggestion. My conclusion is we started to work on this carbon project for RED before RED existed in around 2003. So that's 10 years, looking at maybe 300,000 hectares. And we have not really succeeded. It's been fun, we've learned, we've advanced, we've discovered, but we have not really stopped deforestation. So I'm back to where I began, Mr. Stern, who said this is great, this is going to be the cheapest, most cost-effective way of reducing emissions. Well, we either are not very gifted or he has another slant that we don't, but my conclusion for now is RED is not fast and RED is not simple. However, I've decided I really don't want doom and gloom, so elsewhere there seems to be some really, really cheerful success story in the RED world. Obviously, for me, what's going on in Brazil, and I know some people here are working in Brazil, is extremely fascinating. In Copenhagen, Lula, who was then the president, he took a commitment to reduce the emissions of Brazil, and he decided that the bulk of the reduction of emissions of Brazil would be by tackling deforestation. And the official commitment of the Brazilian government is to reduce 80% of the deforestation of Brazil by 2020. And this is what's been happening between 2004 and 2012. There's been a constant, massive, successful reduction of deforestation in Brazil. This data, it was funny, it was on The Economist that I bought picking my plane to come to Vancouver, very timely. But you can actually go on the website of the government of Brazil, because every year and now even every month, they actually publicize their statistics on deforestation. So it seems like in Brazil, a whole country decided to storm on deforestation with enormous success. Of course, people say, maybe it's not going to stay, maybe it's going to... Yeah, of course. You don't, if you fight something, it's a constant concern. But they've certainly achieved tremendous success in terms of what I hope I've shown you is an extremely complicated situation. Imagine if we had so much trouble on a few thousand, hundreds of thousands of hectares. Imagine how complicated it is to tackle deforestation in the Amazon. So we're now going to come to the last part of my lecture, which is coming back home. on complex issue and on climate change mitigation. And the bottom line is, well, if Brazil did it, are they much smarter than us? So what are we doing, and what could we do? So here are the emissions from the big emitters. Of course, the big players are the US and China, and Canada is not a very big emitter at all, 3% of global emissions, more or less. Okay, so globally, we're not contributing very much. But as you know, as scientists, we can look at things in many different ways. So let's look at it this way. So if we look at emissions per capita, then we're the winner of the world. The Canadian citizen and the citizens of the US, we are those who emit more on a per head basis, my head and your head. So what is it? What is our level of emission? Remember, Brazil said we're going to knock down 80% of deforestation by 2020. So I prepared this figure because people tend to have difficulty on emissions reduction commitment. And people are saying, yeah, but Canada, we don't have anything. We walked out of Kyoto. Well, that's not really true. So let's look in the past. So the emissions reduction target for climate change under the Protocol of Kyoto that aimed at developed nations were indeed in the Protocol of Kyoto. And for Canada, the target was 6% of reduction from 1990. Okay, so this is the emissions of 1990. And our obligations under the Protocol of Kyoto was to go back to this red line, -6 of 1990. The current emissions reduction of the federal government is actually this, okay? They changed the baseline, little tricks, and now they're saying we're going to reduce by 17%. Yes, we're going to reduce by 17% of 2005, but 17% of 2005 is actually more than -6 of 1990, okay? So we're not really reducing very much. Actually, this is the last full data set for Canada's emission, and we're far up, much higher than 1990. So Brazil seems to be able to do something we seem to not be able to do. How do we compare to other countries? Because the climate change fight, I reckon, it is really a negotiation for power and money, okay? Because if you are going to reduce emissions, it means you're going to have to restructure your transport sector, the industry, etc. So it's a largely economical game. And what you want is the big player in this game so that people compete with each other. So you know where we are, and I would like to point out Norway. Why Norway? Well, Norway is a country that is extracting petroleum. They don't have tar sand, but they have petroleum in the North Sea. And they haven't said, I'm not extracting this anymore. However, they've said, in 2030, we will be fully carbon neutral, and we will have reduced by 30% of 1990 in 2020. So they're actually trying to wean themselves off carbon by taking the income from their petroleum to do so. And Norway is the single largest investor in Brazil. So a part of the success of Brazil is due to the fact that Norwegians are helping Brazil to do that, which is a kind of a nice positioning. It's nice to also compare to other countries that are maybe more have a history in common with Canada, like UK or Australia, all of which are proposing fairly substantial emissions reduction. So you're bound to wonder, if we don't embark in this train of emissions reduction, how will we fare? Because it's basically like sticking to the old ways. Aren't we missing the new ways? It was very striking for me last year. I had a PhD student working in Quebec in the field, in the forest, but near a place where we had windmill. The technician that operated the windmill was flown in from Germany. Interesting. I was wondering really why we were not having the expertise to do that ourselves. The developed world, I've learned because I was negotiator for how developing country could reduce their emission. The developed world were telling us it's easy. Just look by sector of your economy and target a sector and reduce the emissions per sector, taking the least expensive and easier to do. So it seems like we could do similar exercise for Canada. So here are our emissions sector. Transport and oil and gas are our big sectors of emission. Actually, in Quebec, there's something interesting. We have 25% of our emissions coming from mining extraction. And here are the big emitters. So the situation of Quebec, BC, Ontario are relatively similar. We have, obviously, Alberta with known sources of emissions. So in Quebec, 25% of the emissions come from the mining sector. And last year, the prime minister of the time, he announced with a lot of pride his new vision for the development of Quebec. We call it Le Plan Nord. And so basically, Le Plan Nord is a plan to foster, stimulate mining industry up north without any measures of control of greenhouse gases. So we in Quebec have adopted an emission reduction target similar to that of Europe, minus 20% of 1990. So that is a law in Quebec. We've adopted that. We're legally binded to reduce as much as Europe. And as we're supposed to fight that, we also want to increase mining production. So with Guillaume, we tried to see what actually is that doing, okay? So to reach Quebec's emission target by 2020, we need to reduce 11 million tons. So we're 8 million people. Every one of us, every year, we should reduce by 1.5 ton or something, okay? So we can actually make these sorts of calculations. But we've looked at some of the mining projects that were proposed by the Canadian government, and it would add to our effort about 3 million tons per year of reduction. So basically, the proposal of the government to promote the mining sector is increasing our burden as every one of us citizens if we really want to meet the target. Or we can do like Canada and say, well, we took a target, but we should abandon the target. So there seems to be a big problem of coherence, and I'm sure you're happy I took an example of Quebec, right? You cannot fault me for that. So it's interesting that as we were playing with those mining emissions, we found very similar issues as what we have when we're working with the forest sector. It's very complicated to try to have a good emissions, and we have some of the same error around our emissions as we have in the land use. In this little graph, we took existing mines, and this is a very, very rough estimate of emissions that could come with the expansion promoted by the government. I mean, you can just look at the graph and see how emissions would skyrocket, but the data are full of uncertainty, so we really need to do a better job of that. Yet, if we were coherent, there is all sorts of things we could do. The government could say all the mines must be on the hydroelectric grid, not use diesel. That would reduce emissions a lot. We could look at the different processes of transformation or recycling. We could really think about transportation. This mine is interesting. It's Indian mine. So basically, they're going to extract the raw mineral, put it on a ship it to India. India will transform it, and I bet will send it back to us. Okay? So in terms of emission, that's hardly a good thing. And I'm not really sure that in terms of economy, it makes much more sense. Okay, I think we might want to think about that. We might want to think about a carbon market. I'll talk to that in my next slide. We might want to think about what do we do with those income, thinking about what the Norwegian did. And we might want to think about the rhythm of all of this extraction that we're doing. If we're basing our economy on this extraction of non-renewable resources, what will be left for my grandchildren, you know? So maybe we could also extract, but transform more and leave some things behind for the generations to come. There's been great hope that BC, because I'm going to talk to you about a little bit as well, you might want to join this Western Climate Initiative. Currently, there are 30 different countries or regions that are part of carbon markets, and we can discuss a long time whether that's good or bad, but certainly carbon market can be part of a solution, at least stimulating industries to emit less. And the Western Climate Initiative for now has two partners, California and Quebec, and I believe BC is pretty much on the spotlight. There's great hope that that BC would join. And what it means is that the markets for commodity within countries that have signed a carbon market, these countries should all favor buying goods that were produced with the least possible carbon. Okay, so it's creating certainly incentives. My last slide is just to kind of make publicity in a few different ways. I've been discussing with several of you, and I don't have a logo yet because the agreement is just being signed. I've decided that I'm irritated enough by Canada's climate change policy, and I hope that I've shown that if Brazil, if Panama is trying to do something about their emissions, why aren't we doing more than what we are? And that it's a responsibility I have as a scientist. So we're creating a new chair. It's called the UNESCO Chair for Dialogues on Sustainability. And I'm hoping that a part of that will be to sort of develop the Weight Watcher for carbon for Canada, you know, solutions. If we're overweight with carbon, we have to be able to reduce. I was a very plump adolescent, and I went on a diet, and I did not gain weight thereafter. So I'm sure we actually can do that if we put brains together. And I've been trying to sort of promote positive action, because I think that a part of where we're going to go is us offering solution rather than being doom and gloom. So we're doing a video project. You can go on that. I actually put the links here. And we're starting to film a new series of video with alumni. And they are to be called the Positive Action Video. 3 minutes video saying great things that can be done. So to try and make you feel excited, this is a Lane House, carbon neutral in Vancouver. But because I had meetings back to back for the 2 days I've been here, I couldn't go and film it. So I'm sort of hoping that there will be students here that will say, oh yeah, that's cool. And you have a carbon zero building here, which would be really good in that positive action video. So just trying to spread the word that things can be done. And then if we start to do things, maybe we can change the attitudes. Thank you.